walking the serpentine path, following the footsteps of the ancestors, walking the serpentine path, making our way back home. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho, hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, ho. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho. Following the serpentine path. Life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Serpentine Path podcast. My name is Claire Wowdy Yasid, and I will be your guide on the serpentine path of life. I'm a songkeeper, plant walker, storyteller, word weaver, artesana, visual and performance artist, daughter, granddaughter, sister, lover, student, and friend, among many, many, many other things. I've spent my life traversing through altered states of consciousness and find it fascinating to explore all the ways in which our modern culture has become almost entirely severed from our innate instinctual and intuitive ability to see beyond the veil of so called reality. In this podcast, I will be sharing my own personal stories and insights regarding all things related to plant medicine, the birth, death, rebirth cycle, ancestral reconnection, intergenerational healing, womb sovereignty and bodily autonomy, dream work, rites of passage and initiations, time travel, shape-shifting, dimension hopping, and the reclamation of our collective earth-based practices, all of which I consider to be portals into altered states of consciousness. I thank you with my deepest respect and humility for taking the time to open your ears, your minds, and your hearts to what it is that I have to share. The telling of one's story is an intimate and vulnerable experience. It is also, in my opinion, one of the most powerful, illuminating, liberating, and healing medicines that a person can offer to the world. Hearing the cadence in a storyteller's voice, their laughter, their tears, their tone, their pauses, their pain, their joy, their curiosity, and their heart's song is something that can only truly be experienced by way of oral storytelling. Thus, in honoring the storytelling lineages of all of our ancestors, I offer my story to you now. In another world, another time, another dream, we're all sitting together in front of a big fire, passing our visions across the flames and receiving the medicine in our hearts. So, again, welcome to the serpentine path where the ancestors have called us back to. Let's start at the end and find our way back home together. So, for those of you who have not already listened to the first part of this two-part episode, Midwifing My Elders Through the Portal of Death, Part 1, I would suggest that you go back one episode and take some time to listen to that, just so that you have some context. Where I left off with the story was that I had traveled back to the United States after my grandma had passed away in order to attend her graveside memorial and to spend Christmas with my family. And I'm going to be picking the story back up when I went back to the jungle 2 weeks later, where I continued to accompany my teacher, Abuelo Querubin, alongside my partner, Vincent. So let's get into the second part now.
So when I got back to the jungle after my grandmother's graveside memorial, Abuelo was full-time down at the farm, and during the weeks that I had been gone, my partner Vincent and Abuelo's other caretaker had found a really good rhythm down at the farm. And Abuelo was really happy because he absolutely hated being up in town. It's loud, it's by the road, there's a lot of dogs and just noise. And he liked just being in the forest with the birds and the quiet and the trees. And so I got back, and Abuelo was doing pretty well, honestly. My very first night back, we had a big ceremony with some people who came from Mexico. So there were probably like 20 people at least from Mexico, and then like 10 other people from the family, and me and Vincent and some other people who were on the farm. And that was a really, really intense ceremony. I remember at one point looking into Abuelo's room where he stayed during ceremony these days, and he was doing healings for people, one after another, after another, after another, probably like 10 healings in one night. And I was so shocked. I was like, oh my God, this man, like, he never ceases to surprise me. I can't believe that he's doing this right now. And he was so strong, hearing his chants and feeling the medicine that he was moving, how he was driving the ceremony and navigating the space. It just never ceased to amaze me, his power. And after that, I think there was like one or two more ceremonies that I was able to do with him. Also, really strong ceremonies every time. Really strong. And then pretty quickly, his health began deteriorating pretty intensely. And there was one day where, maybe over like 2 or 3 days, I guess, he was just getting worse and worse and worse. And they were having other shamans come and try to give him healings down at the farm. And he would get a little bit better, and then it would get worse and better and worse. And the hard thing was that it was approaching the dry season, like the summer season, where it's just unbelievably hot. And a lot of the time, the power will go out in the jungle during, well, the power goes out in general. If it's rainy or dry season, it doesn't matter. But the power was going out a lot, and so he didn't have like a fan to keep him cool. And so he was just like really, really suffering. And finally, we had to get him up to town because it was just too hard to keep him down at the farm. And so they called a car to bring him up to town, one of the neighbors, and he looked at us and he really said, okay, guys, I don't know if I'm ever going to come back down to this farm. So if this is it, then this is it. And me and my partner Vincent were just like, okay, Abuelo, we love you. We love you, and we'll come visit you every day up in town, and we'll take care of the farm and the animals and everything. Don't worry. Just take care of yourself. So he went back up to town, and he was right. The only other time that he came back down to the farm was for a ceremony later that week, which was specifically for him. He got worse and worse throughout the week. He was getting really sick. And again, like ups and downs and ups and downs and ups and downs. And we went and visited him every day. And one day we went to visit him, and he was doing pretty well this day. He was pretty calm. It was kind of later in the afternoon. It was at like 5 p.m., kind of right before the sun went down, when it's usually not so hot, a little bit calmer and cooler, and when he was a little bit more lucid and available. And so we walked in, me and my partner, and we sat down quietly. And Abuela was just laying on the bed, kind of with his eyes closed, and Vincent sat on the bed next to him, and they started talking. And after a little bit, I interjected into the conversation, and Abuelo hadn't realized that I was there. He thought that just Vincent had come to visit. And he looked at me and he said, oh, wow, I didn't see you there. But wow, how beautiful you are. I'm dying. and you're flying like the angels. And it was such a beautiful, beautiful, heartbreaking moment. Estoy muriendo y usted está volando como los ángeles. And it was, I don't know how to explain it, such a special moment that he was really coming to peace with his death more and more and more. He had been moving towards it for like over a year, almost a year and a half of being sick, and he knew it was coming. And we talked for a long time that night and shared a lot of funny stories, and he was laughing and doing pretty well, and he had a lot of people accompanying him. There were probably like 4 or 5 of us in the room laughing and asking him questions and stories, and he was doing what he loved to do, which was sharing about his life, sharing about his culture, sharing about his experiences with young people who wanted to learn. That's what really fed Abuelo, when there were young people who wanted to learn. So a few days later, I think it might have even been the next day. No, it was like 2 days later. We went up to visit him, and he was really not good, really, really bad. And out of nowhere, a lot of people arrived, coming from all over. Some of his grandchildren arrived, his sister arrived, other people arrived, and everyone was trying to make him feel better. They were trying to give him healings. They were trying to play music and trying to get him better, and nothing was working. And so Abuelo's grandson-in-law called a really powerful taita from a different village and called to ask him to come and do like a special healing for Abuelo that night. And so we took him down to the farm, and the other taita arrived, and Abuelo was just lying on the bed, and the taita was in the room with him alone, and he was smoking a big tobacco, a big cigar, and he was just observing Abuelo. And he called my partner Vincent and the other caretaker into the room, and he looked at the tobacco and how it had burned and what had happened with it. And he said to them, okay, I'm going to do a healing tonight, and he's going to get better. He's going to improve, and he's going to be good for a little while. But the next time that he gets bad like this, there's nothing that anybody can do. It'll be the end. And that's exactly what ended up happening. The taita did a really strong healing on Abuelo, and the next morning he was doing really well, and he was sitting up, and he was talking, and he was laughing. And again, it was as if nothing had ever happened. And he went up to town, and he was doing pretty well for a few days. And again, my moon had come, and so I couldn't go up and visit him, but my partner Vincent was with him pretty much all day, every day, helping look after him and go as soon as he had finished with breakfast, and came back usually in the kind of late evening before before dinner. And he told me every day, like, he's doing well, he's doing well, he's doing well, he's getting a little bit worse, today was kind of hard, yeah, it's like it's getting bad again, as the other taita had said it would. And so on Wednesday of that week, we were invited to ceremony by another elder. And as I was kind of meditating before ceremony, before like gathering all of my stuff to go over to his farm, I was sitting there and I was meditating, and I just had this very strong knowing that Abuelo was going to die very soon. And I felt like, okay, maybe it's today or tomorrow, actually. And I recognized the sensation from my grandma when my grandma had passed away. And she had come to me in my dream, and I knew that it was going to be just a matter of time. And I had that knowing with Abuelo. I was just like, okay, he's really close. And I told my partner, and my partner said, I don't know, we're gonna see. I mean, the man just keeps kind of aguantando, which means like continuing on. He was like, I don't know, we're gonna see, but we just have to keep going and keep accompanying him through this portal. So we went to ceremony that night with this other elder who had trained with Abuelo for like, I don't know, over 20 years. And he was married to, he is married to Abuela Maria's granddaughter. So he knows Abuelo and Abuela very intimately. And we had a beautiful and very sad conversation with him before ceremony. I was asking him about how he was feeling and how he was doing and what his thoughts were and how he thought things were going to change. And I asked him about, what happens when an elder dies, like an elder of this caliber, like a leader of their nation. What happens? And he said, the last time that something like this happened, where a really, really powerful elder died, over the next 2 or 3 years, almost every other elder in his generation also died. It was like the generation was ending and the new generation of elders started coming up. And it was all just kind of boom, 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 like a ripple effect. And so it was a beautiful but sad conversation, and it was really enlightening and interesting to hear about. And we took our cup of medicine and ceremony started. And pretty quickly I received this beautiful song, which I won't sing the full thing now. I'll probably post that on Patreon at some point soon. But it starts with just the words, Abuelito, maestro de maestros, padre de todos, which means, Abuelo, my dear Abuelo, master of all of the masters, everyone's father. And it was a beautiful song that came through. And later in the night, the elder asked my partner and I if we wanted to sing, and I sang that song. It channeled through me. And it was really interesting in this ceremony too, because I had been super convinced earlier in the night that Abuela was going to die, like that night or the next day. And I had this strong knowing in ceremony that it was actually going to be a little bit longer, a few days more than I had originally anticipated, but I knew that he wasn't going to make it through the weekend. This was on Wednesday night, and so I knew, like, there's no way that he's going to make it to Monday next week. And so, sure enough, that is what ended up happening. On Friday night, we had a ceremony with one of Abuelo's grandsons, and that was down on the farm. But up in town, Abuelo was receiving another healing from another taita. I don't remember which taita it was, but another taita came and gave Abuelo healing. And when I was in ceremony down at the farm with Abuelo's grandson, I just had this moment pretty early in the night, probably at like 11 p.m. or midnight, that Abuelo's soul was no longer kind of in his body. And I was like, okay, it's very possible that he just died. I just felt this moment. And we made it through the ceremony. And in the morning, we ate breakfast really quickly and we went up to town. And when we got there, Abuelo's whole family, like as many people who could arrive, were all there. And we walked into the room and he was lying there and he was unconscious. His mouth was open and he looked like how my grandma had looked when she was in those like transitional phases, like no longer still fully in her body, but hadn't fully moved to the other side. And so I recognized it and I saw him like that. And it was so beautiful, and it was also so sad because I saw Abuelo's whole family just really grieving and in a lot of pain, and people coming in and out and people not being able to stay because they were too overtaken by sadness and pain. And but I was really at peace. And some of Abuelo's grandkids asked Vincent and I to sing, and so we sang a few songs for Abuelo, as we had for years. And it was the last time that we ever got to do that. It was such a gift because I know that he was able to hear us. And it was beautiful when we left because my partner Vincent said, "He's not in pain. He's really okay." I feel really, really happy for him. He's been in pain for so long, for like over a year and a half, and he's finally not in pain anymore. And that was true. Like, he was really at peace. And so we went back down to the farm and we slept because we hadn't slept in like a few days. It was a very intense time, and we slept and we woke up, and our plan was to go up to visit him and to just be there pretty much for as long as we could before coming back down. And as we were gathering our stuff, Vincent got a call from the other caretaker, and he told Vincent that Abuelo had died. So we got all of our stuff and we made our way up to town because we knew that that's where everyone would be going. And we arrived to the house, and there were a lot of people there already. I mean, the man had just died maybe 15 or 20 minutes before, because that's how long it takes to walk up to town. And already there were so many people. And so we got to the house, and we didn't know if we would be able to enter. We wanted to be respectful, but Abuela's family was like, "Come in here right now, come in." And so we walked in, and Vincent went straight to the back, and he helped clean Abuela's body with the other caretaker. And it was interesting because Vincent told me afterwards there were other people who were trying to help, people who hadn't been like with Abuelo so much in the last few months, like super close to him, to help take care of him, and they were trying to help clean the body, and it was way too intense for them. It was too strong. Whereas for Vincent and the other like full-time caretaker, it was of course a very intense and surreal experience, but there was some kind of how to explain it, like they were almost desensitized to it because they had spent so much time with him while he was in that dying portal. And so Vincent cleaned off the body, and I sat inside and I talked with people, and I saw a lot of Abuelo's family members who I know, and I talked with them and asked how his death went. And they said that when he died, he was surrounded by all of the women in his family. His sister, his niece, a lot of his granddaughters. It was like all of the women were by him. He didn't die alone. And it was really peaceful. He just took a big inhale and a big exhale, and it was done. So in the next few hours, hundreds of people started arriving in the village, like hundreds of people from all over. And they put his body in the casket, and they brought him into the what is the word? The cultural house, the big meeting house in the village. And they already had a poster printed out with, his name and his date of birth, date of death, and a big blessing for him. And tons of flowers were arriving. And truly, when I say like that first night was probably 100 and 150 people showed up. And we just stayed all night and we prayed, and people were devastated, and people were also laughing and sharing stories, and people were crying, and people were together. And we stayed until pretty late at night, until like midnight. And afterwards, everyone kind of went their separate ways to sleep. And the next morning, Vincent and I woke up pretty late. We were exhausted, and we got up to town, and again, there were like 200, maybe 300 people. There were people in the big kitchen cooking for everyone. They had food. I don't even know how they organized this, but they had food for every single person who came. They had, cooked like a huge thing of chicken soup for people. They had tons of like rice and arepas and like refreshments to go around, like every single person they were able to feed. And people were arriving from all over the place, all over Colombia, from everywhere, like literally. And flowers were being sent from all over the world. And it was so beautiful because there were a lot of course, Cofan people, and also a lot of non-Indigenous people, a lot of people from other Indigenous communities, a lot of foreigners who all came and who were celebrating his life. And there was so much music all day long. People were playing music. Whoever wanted to get up to the microphone and play the guitar and sing. And so one after another, people were getting up and they were playing, and everyone was singing and everyone was crying and everyone was laughing and sharing stories. And one of the elders in the village, who's now like the oldest abuelo in the village since Abuelo Querubin died, he is Abuelo Querubin's cousin, Abuelo Renerio. He told us it's really important that we're all here because until Abuelo's body is in the ground, his spirit is still walking around. It's still kind of in limbo. And so we need to be here to accompany that process. And then when he goes into the ground, we can all kind of go our separate ways. But for now, we all really need to be together and we need to support him in his transition, which is what we did. And so Abuelo died on Saturday afternoon. Sunday, all day long, we were celebrating him. And Monday morning, we woke up pretty early. Vincent went to help all of the men dig Abuelo's grave, and Abuelo wanted to be buried behind his maloca, his big, beautiful maloca. And the maloca is like the ceremonial house where people would drink medicine. And so Vincent was in the back with all of the men digging this big hole. And I was just kind of getting the space cleaned up and prepared. And at a certain point, I heard singing. I heard a ton of people singing, and they had been carrying Abuelo's coffin down, which is a long walk. It's like a 20-minute walk, pretty intense walk down to the farm. But all of these people were walking and carrying his coffin down. And they all arrived, and again, there was hundreds of people surrounding his grave, and a few different elders spoke. And a lot of them were like some of the most powerful shamans in that part of the jungle, and some of the most powerful shamans from Abuelo's family, one of his sons, some of his grandsons, grandson-in-laws. And these are men who are extremely disciplined. They really keep their emotions very, very close to the chest. Men who you will never, ever see like express a lot. And these men could barely talk. They were sobbing. I remember one of them almost passed out when he was reading Abuelo's beautiful eulogy. They could barely keep it together, and that was so beautiful to see so many really, really powerful spiritual leaders and political leaders grieving so deeply the loss of their taita, the leader of their whole nation, their spiritual and political leader. And they eventually lowered his body into the ground, and people could throw dirt in, and people were screaming and crying and really expressing their grief and sadness. And they covered the grave, and people were singing all around the grave, beautiful music in Cofan, music in Spanish, everything. And then after that, everyone left pretty quickly. And Vincent and I went into town. We didn't have any food in the house because the week had been so intense. We went into town to do some grocery shopping and to get some lunch. And on our way back, it started pouring rain. And again, we were in the middle of summertime when there's pretty much no rain at all. It doesn't rain for like months straight. And it had been really, really dry all week as Abuelo had been dying. It had been like extremely, extremely dry, which was also why Abuelo was suffering so much, because it was so hot. And as soon as we put him into the ground, within just a few hours, it started pouring rain and thundering and lightning and just like a torrential downpour for like over a day, I think. Like it was like nonstop. And that was entirely not a surprise. Abuelo, one of his many spiritual powers was that he could call lightning and thunder and big storms. With his chanting, he was able to call that. And so as soon as he passed, yeah, it's insane downpour. And I was remembering what Vincent had said, that Abuelo had told him a few days before he died. He was really calm and really meditative one day, and Vincent was asking him, how do you feel about dying? How do you feel about the other side? How do you feel about this process? And he looked at Vincent and he said, after I die, there will still be the jungle. There will always be the jungle. And that's all he said. So I remember like this pouring, insane, torrential downpour, and just looking out at the jungle and seeing the mist rise up off of the trees and seeing it over the river. And just being in total awe of the territory and in total awe of the man who was the guardian of that territory for his entire life, for his entire 110 years on this earth. And so that night, because it was raining so much, Vincent and I put like a big rain cover over his grave so that it wouldn't get destroyed. All of the beautiful flowers that had been put there and candles and everything. And then we sat by the grave and we just talked and we cried and we shared. And in one moment, my partner went over and he kneeled in front of the grave and he had a private moment with Abuelo. And I remember sitting in front of the fire, was just crying. And I was trying to sing, and I couldn't. And I looked up, and I saw Abuelo right in front of me. He was younger. I saw him as a younger version of himself, but really, really strong with all of his shamanic clothing, his traditional clothes, his big feather crown, big jaguar tooth necklace, all of the kind of symbols of his shamanic power. And he looked at me and he said, now the real work starts, Clarita. Now it starts. You all have to figure out how you're going to walk this path without my physical presence. You gotta work. And I was like, fuck, okay, here we go. And so the next day, his grandchildren came down and they gathered all of Abuelo's stuff up. They cleaned out the whole house. They put all of his clothes and his things into big bags. And Vincent dug a huge grave by Abuelo's grave, where his body was, and they buried pretty much all of his stuff. The only things that they kept were a lot of his books, because Abuelo was like a really voracious reader, so they kept all of his books and all of his musical instruments and like pictures of him and that kind of thing. And things from his altar that he had in his altar, and they put all of those altar pieces into an altar in the ceremonial house for people who wanted to come and who wanted to connect with Abuelo. And then his family asked Vincent and I if we would stay living at the farm and help them look after things, and to help them continue welcoming people who wanted to drink medicine and do healings with the family. And so we said, yes, of course, we'll stay and we'll help you do that. And that's where we stayed for about 4 months before deciding that it was time to make a transition. And so after that, it was devastating. It was really devastating, and continues to be very devastating and heartbreaking, and seeing how everyone deals with grief very differently in the family. But so that was February. That was February when Abuelo passed away, and so then a few months went by where we were moving through our process of grief and working on the farm and still in ceremony and figuring stuff out. And then in May, my grandfather, who had been really, really struggling with his health for a long time, he had finally made the decision that he was ready to do assisted suicide, and that it was time for him to transition. And it was a very quick decision. It was like, I think he made the decision, and maybe 2 or 3 days later was the appointment. And so it was a fast thing, and my dad had to fly across the country in order to be there with him. And I asked my dad to let me know when that process was starting. And so he texted me, I believe it was like a Monday or a Tuesday. Texted me and said, hey, we're all here. We're about to inject the medication. So whatever you want to do in order to accompany us, you can start doing it. And so I took a tobacco and I went to the river, and I prayed for my grandfather's passing, as I had been doing for almost a year. I guess it was like 10 or 11 months, actually. Almost a full year of me praying for my grandfather and his passing. And it was the last time that I prayed for him and thanked him for his life, as difficult and as challenging and as painful as it had been. I thanked him so much for everything that he had been through, for how deeply he persisted in this life, for all of the gifts that he offered to me and to my father and my father's family. I thanked him for his service as a healer. And I was reflecting back on a few of the conversations that I had had with him over the months when I had thought that he was going to die, because we thought that my grandpa was going to die multiple times. And as I was praying, I was thanking him for those conversations, and I was thinking about two in particular. One was when he told me that when I was a little baby, I was at my grandma's house, and my grandpa was there as well. And I was on the couch, and I think I was like yawning or something and doing a big stretch like how little babies do. And my grandma looked at my grandpa and she said, Gary, look at that. That's our first grandchild. And it was such a sweet story for my grandpa to share with me. He was just talking about how amazed he was, the beauty of life, looking at his grandchild, his very first granddaughter. And then I also thought about another phone call a few days before where I asked my grandfather, what were the most beautiful parts of your life? And he said, well, the first thing I would say was my work as a doctor and the people that I helped. Some of those early patients in my early years who I was able to support, they made a really big impact on me at the beginning of my career. And then he said, the next thing is definitely my relationship with your grandmother, who my grandma passed when I was like 14. He said she supported me so much when we first moved to Colorado Springs and I was developing my practice and I was working all the time, and she really made it possible for me to do my work by everything that she did at home with the kids. And she was really an integral part of my growth in medicine. And then he said, and the last thing was all of those times that we all got together as a family over Christmas or Thanksgiving or Easter or birthdays, when everyone was together in the house and I got to see all of you girls, because on my dad's side of the family, there's only granddaughters. There's 5 of us, all granddaughters. And he said, seeing my whole family like that, together, every time, that was probably one of the best parts of my life. And so I sat at the river and I recalled all of those memories and those conversations with him and all of the times throughout my childhood that I can remember spending with him, the good and the bad. And I thanked him for having come to me a little bit less than a year before and sharing his life with me throughout the whole year and allowing me to accompany him, even though I wasn't physically there with him, but on a spiritual level, for sharing so much with me in my dreams, sharing so much with me in my visions, and for being such a beautiful teacher and guide in the process of accompanying so many people through that transition. First with Abuela Maria, then with my grandmother Marnie, then with Abuelo Querubin, and finally with my grandpa Gary, who kind of started it all for me. And there was a moment when I just knew that I had nothing left to say, no more goodbyes. And I gathered my things and I headed back to the house. And I cooked some dinner for me and my partner, and I was on my way to bed and I checked my phone and my dad let me know that my grandfather had finally passed. It took him a few hours, but he had finally passed, and I was just so grateful. And it was really interesting because I was sure that my grandpa was going to come to me in a dream that night, because he had been visiting me in dreams for almost a year. And so I was sure that he was going to come and visit me, and he didn't. And then maybe a night or two later, we had ceremony, and I was sure that he was going to come visit me in ceremony because, again, he had been coming to me in visions for almost a year, and he didn't come. And I was sad because I had grown so familiar to his arrivals in those altered states of consciousness. And I was sad, and I think now when I look back on it, it's actually something to be really, really grateful for. I think now I feel as though he had come to me to share a lot of parts of his story with me, many of which were very painful and very sad, and he had never been able to really share them with probably almost anyone in his life because he guarded it so close to the chest. And when he arrived at death, he had nothing else that he needed to kind of get off his chest. And so the fact that he wasn't coming to me, actually, I think now, I believe, means that he had found peace on the other side. So that was in May. And then at the end of June, my partner Vincent and I ended up going back to the States again. So it had been about 6 months since I had been there the last time with my grandma when she had just passed. And we were going back specifically for the memorial of my grandparents. So my grandmother Marnie, my mom's mom, and my grandfather Robert, who had passed away, I guess about 4 years ago now. Yeah, summer of 2020, during COVID. He passed because of COVID. And so they actually did a joint memorial service together, which was really beautiful. And so I went with my partner and I got to be with my family, and it was my whole extended family, my Texas side of the family, my grandma's Texas side of the family all flew in. My grandfather's Connecticut side of the family was all there. And it was so beautiful to reconnect with that part of myself, because we don't spend a lot of time with my extended family. We're spread out all across the country, and so we don't get those really precious moments anymore these days. So that was incredibly nourishing, I would say, just from my sense of orientation, to say, wow, okay, like this is my blood. These are my people, and this is where I come from. This is a big part of who I am. And it was so beautiful to introduce my partner to all of my extended family. He had met, of course, my family and my aunts and uncles, but never like all of my cousins and everything like that. And so that was so beautiful. And the service itself was very Episcopalian in the style of my grandparents, but it was perfect in that way because my grandma had selected everything for the service. And my grandma, throughout her entire life, was deeply committed to her faith, as I've mentioned, but especially in her last few years, she really kind of became like a biblical scholar. It was so beautiful. She did like an entire multi-year training, I believe, at her church, and she had a really special relationship with one of the ministers. And so, she got to be the creatrix, I guess, of her memorial. She got to pick which passages were going to be read. She got to pick which songs were going to be sung. My mother's eulogy was really beautiful, what she shared about my grandparents and my aunt and my uncle. They did kind of a combined eulogy together, and that was really special. They talked about how my grandparents were deeply committed to their relationship with one another, how much they were committed to their family, to their community, to their faith in God. And they shared a lot about my grandparents' life, how they traveled together, my grandfather's work as a doctor, my grandmother's work as a university professor in economics. They talked all about how generous my grandparents were, how loving and open-hearted they were, how profoundly caring they were, and how loving and accepting and supportive they were. Even though they were very traditional, they were also really, really open-hearted people. And they were curious, and they were really hungry to always learn, and to see that church filled with all of the people who loved and respected my grandparents and who came to honor their life was so special. Again, it was super different from what I had experienced in the jungle. Very, very different, but really sacred in its own way. And I got to read a passage from the Bible, which was fun. I'm not a Bible person, but got to read a beautiful passage, and as did my sisters and my cousins. And then a little bit later, I'd say about a month after that, was my grandfather's memorial in Colorado, which I unfortunately didn't get to go to. My sister had had an operation. She needed support in her healing process, and so I decided to stay with my mother and my sister in Pennsylvania while my father went to his father's memorial, which I am sad about that I missed that occasion to honor my grandfather, especially considering that he had had such a profound impact on me throughout the year, throughout my 27th year. And I also knew that what would have been most important for my grandfather in that moment would have been for me to stay with my mother and my sister and support my family through a really, really important healing process. And so that's the best way to honor my grandfather, because my grandfather was a healer. Both of my grandfathers actually were both doctors and healers. And so I stayed, and my father, when he came back from the memorial, told me some really beautiful things about all these people that came from his childhood growing up in Colorado Springs. All of his friends, all of his sports coaches, all of his teachers from high school, everyone, they came and they supported not only my grandfather, but also my dad's family as a whole. My grandmother, who had passed, goodness, I guess almost 15 years ago now. And my father sent the bullet points from the eulogy that he gave. He kind of improvised it based off of some points, but eulogy, he spoke a lot about my grandfather's work as a doctor. He shared a story about how right after my grandmother had passed away, my grandfather was, of course, deeply sad and grieving. And the very next day, someone came to his door and said, "I don't know if you remember me, but you saved my life years ago." And he talked about how my grandfather was deeply dedicated to his work. And he also talked about the beauty in death is that it's also a reunification of those who have already passed on. And so my father also talked about how, at this point in time, my grandfather is no longer physically with us here, but he is back together with his wife and with his son, who passed away when he was only 2 years old. And that was a deep wound that my grandfather carried for his whole life, because he himself was a doctor and he was a healer, and he could not save his own son from dying, and that was a really, really painful weight to carry his whole life. And so I'm immensely, immensely grateful that my grandfather is reunited, and I feel the same way about my grandmother. She so, so desperately wanted to get back to my grandfather who had passed. She was really, really missing him. And after she passed, my mom sent me this beautiful photo of them when they were on one of their travels, and they were just relaxing by the beach with big sun hats, because my grandma was very careful to never be in the sun too much. And it was just the sweetest picture of them. When I think about them on the other side, I think about them that way. I think about them just relaxing and enjoying each other's company and traveling the world. And I feel the same way about Abuelo Querubin and Abuela Maria. The day after Abuelo died, someone sent me a beautiful picture of Abuelo and Abuela in a ceremony. And I'll share the picture on the Patreon so that you guys can see. And they're both dressed in all their ceremonial clothing. And Abuelo, he had his big feather crown and his jaguar tooth necklace, and he had his face painted. And Abuela looked so beautiful. Her hair was loose. It was usually pulled back into a tight bun, but it was loose and really flowing. And she had her traditional jewelry that she had woven herself. And I believe he had his staff in his hand, and it was just the most gorgeous picture. And when I saw this picture, I just cried and cried. Because I knew that they were back together again, dancing through the stars, dancing through the ceremony of life together, as they always have through every lifetime. So, to end this two-part series, two-part episode of my 27th year of midwifing my elders through the portal of death, I'll share something that one of Abuelo's daughter-in-laws shared with me. At some point in the year, I think it was before Abuela Maria had died, that's for sure. But it was after I had learned that my grandmother had cancer, so it was probably in like August or early September. And Abuelo's daughter-in-law was talking with me one day before ceremony, and she was asking me how my process was going with the medicine and being down at the farm alone and what I was learning from the abuelos and everything. And I shared with her, I found out that my grandmother has cancer, and I told her about the dream that I had had a few days before, where I knew that she was going to be dying soon. And I told her, I was like, it's so strange. All of my elders are dying right now, and it's a really intense process, but it's so beautiful to be a part of. And this is something that's so lost in my culture and in my lineage. The honoring of our elders and the honoring of their lineage and of their dying processes. It's really not a thing that people from my culture currently really know how to hold space for. And it's so interesting, because I'm watching the abuelos old and dying in front of me. And I'm feeling my grandparents going through the same process. And it's really intense, but it's probably the most important work that I've done on my path so far, is accompanying them. And she said something so beautiful to me that I will never forget. She said, "Cada abuelo es lo mismo abuelo." And that means every grandparent, every elder is the same grandparent and the same elder. She said, the work that you're doing here, accompanying abuelo and abuela, shows that you understand that it does not matter if someone is your blood relative or not. Every single elder, every single grandparent deserves to be loved and cared for in that dying portal. Every single elder and every single grandparent needs young people of many generations to come be by their side and to give them the strength to continue on and to move into that transition. And so what you're doing here is so much bigger than just your blood lineage, than just abuelo and abuela. What you're doing here is reconnecting to the truth that so many of us have lost around the world, which is the understanding that every elder needs to be accompanied towards their death. Every single one of them in those dying years, they have to be accompanied. And it was so simple, and it was so profound at the same time, because when I look at how our culture has been just so distorted when it comes to our understanding of how to care for the elderly, how to care for the sick, how to care for the dying, and also our lack of connection to elders, these days. I would say, particularly in Western culture and white culture in the United States, where we really do not prioritize the wisdom and the strength and the power and the advice of elders. And of course, there's many reasons for that. But at the end of the day, beyond anything, they somehow have made it through this life and survived in this crazy, crazy fucking world for many years more than we have. Many, many years. And they've gone through hard things, and they've gone through beautiful things, and they've created life, and they've created lives. And so, if anything, if nothing else, they deserve our respect because they've been doing this life thing for a lot longer than we have. And so, this whole process in my 27th year, all of the deaths that I experienced, each one of them, the shocking ones, the expected ones, the devastating ones, the peaceful ones, the confusing ones, the illuminating ones, every single instance of death was such a profound lesson in understanding what it means for that wheel to turn, for the elders to pass on, and for them to pass their stories, pass their gifts, pass their weaknesses, pass their strengths, pass their blessings and their teachings on to the next generations. There has been no greater lesson in my life than this past year. I chose to refer to this process as midwifing because traditionally a midwife was not just someone who attended births. Traditionally, the title of a midwife was someone who accompanied all of the people in their family, in their community, their village, whatever, through all of life's initiation points. So they say that traditionally the midwife was someone who accompanied all of their people from womb to tomb. And it's something I think about a lot as I'm moving into the next few years of wanting to create a family and becoming a portal for birth, and what that's going to mean for my body and for my spirit and for every single transformation that's going to ask of me. I'm so grateful that I became so intimate with the portal of death, because it's truly two sides of the same coin. And it's been the most profound gift of my life, as I've said before, and I'll say 100 times more. Death is not something to be afraid of. It's something to learn from, something to welcome into our hearts, something for us to become intimate with again. We used to really understand death in a very different way when we lived far away from cities and we were deeply connected to the earth, and we saw plants living and dying, animals living and dying. We saw rivers overflowing and drying up, and we attended to the birthing people, and we attended to the dying people, and we attended to all of those stages in life, and we knew how to grieve, and we knew how to mourn, and we knew how to celebrate life. And that's a teaching that is irreplaceable for me at this point, as a 28-year-old, as someone who grew up in a culture that is so death phobic. It's a blessing to know death intimately. And it's a blessing to have been able to accompany my elders through that part of their life. And it's a blessing to know that they're always here with me, no matter what, that they're actually with me more now than they ever were.
So this concludes the 2-part episode of Midwifing My Elders Through the Portal of Death. And for those of you who are subscribed to the Patreon, I continue this story a little bit, particularly around the deaths of Abuelo Querubin and my grandfather, Gary. The first part of that episode, I talk about two really beautiful conversations that I had with some kids in the village after Abuelo passed away, and how beautiful it was to see the cultural differences between our understandings of death, our understandings of ancestors and elders and people who have passed on, and how transformative it was for me to shift my perspective and to see a vision of death through these children's eyes. And then the second part of that episode, I talk about my grandfather Gary and his famous last words as he was receiving the medication that allowed him to commit assisted suicide. Um, I still can't believe he said what he said, but my grandpa was a wild one. So, yeah, I share about that on the Patreon. So, thank you guys so much. And we'll be back with another episode very soon. So, thank you for your support.